Today, there is very good news on the front line of the Ukrainian-Russian war. It concerns the fact that yesterday evening, at night, it became known, and the General Staff, most importantly, confirmed it, that a strike was launched on the town of Oktyabrsk, near Yeysk, Krasnodar Territory, in the Russian Federation. The Russian-Iranian Shahed storage bases were hit there, where, according to the Ukrainian General Staff, up to 400 units of such drones were stored. It is from Yeysk that Russians usually launch drones into Ukraine. Here is Yeysk, located in the Krasnodar Territory. It was hit by a Ukrainian shell, and this is not the first time, by the way. The General Staff admitted that it was a joint effort with the Ukrainian Navy. Therefore, it can be concluded that Ukrainian Neptune R-360 cruise missiles were used, since the Navy is their operator. The Russians wrote that a warehouse with cylinders was hit, but this is not so important. For example, the video shows very clearly how everything is burning brightly, especially at the end of the recording. Thanks to eyewitnesses, we can see the splatter characteristic of a shard, a gushing flash, a fireworks explosion. This is yet another confirmation that it was a shard. But yesterday, not only shards were hit, the arsenal of the main missile and artillery directorate of the Russian Ministry of Defense was also hit in the Bryansk region, near the city of Bryansk, in the village of Karachev, 114 kilometers from the border with Ukraine. This is the fourth such depot destroyed in the last month. Before that, there were 2 warehouses in the Pskov region and 1 in the Krasnodar region. The destruction of such depots makes it much more difficult for the Russians to supply ammunition to their units. This will have a significant impact on the Kursk grouping of Russian forces, as it is there that they actively use artillery. Given the difficulties in supplying ammunition, the Russians will be forced to look for alternative ways to attack, such as airstrikes. I have told you these 2 pieces of good news about the Shahedis and the destruction of the 67th arsenal of the main missile and artillery directorate of the Russian Ministry of Defense. Now let's talk about less pleasant circumstances. Yesterday, the Russians claimed that they had destroyed Ukrainian Patriot launchers and radar stations in Zaporizhzhia. I have great doubts about this statement. Although the Russians have shown a video that allegedly confirms their victory, I will question this and demonstrate why. Let's start by looking at the video released by the Russian side. The Russians claim to have hit the Ukrainian Patriot complex in Zaporizhzhia, but if you take a closer look, it is not at all clear. First of all, the radar they show in the footage does not have the features that are characteristic of Patriot radar systems. It could be any other equipment, perhaps even Soviet style, but not modern American air defense systems. It is also important to note that the Russians often use fakes or exaggerate their successes to boost morale and support their domestic propaganda. As of today, we have no confirmation that the Patriot was actually hit. The General Staff of Ukraine has not made any such statements either. If such an event had really taken place, it would have been officially recognized. Another factor that casts doubt on the reliability of this information is the geolocation. If we analyze the location of the explosion in the video, it does not correspond to the area where Patriot is usually deployed in Zaporizhzhia. Thus, there is every reason to believe that this is another propaganda manipulation by Russia. Now let's turn to the situation at the front. Heavy fighting continues in the Avdiivka sector. The Russians are trying to surround the city, but Ukrainian defenders are bravely holding the line, destroying large groups of enemy infantry and equipment. It should be noted that in recent days, there have been more reports of Russians actively using heavy equipment, including tanks and artillery. This indicates that the Russians are moving reserves from other parts of the front, which indicates their heavy losses and lack of forces. Yesterday, there was some update on the location of the Russians in the area of Robotyno. However, this is not an offensive, it is only an update of the old positions that have been occupied by the Russians recently, concentrating their forces here due to the fact that Robotyno is a destroyed settlement, is an extremely difficult task for the Russians, beyond their means. And all those actions, all those conversations, and ultimately, all that information about the enemy's major offensive that is allegedly being prepared in the Zaporizhzhia sector, in my opinion, is nothing more than an attempt to draw our forces, resources, and information away from the main place of attack, from Donetsk region. Because in order to attack here, in Zaporizhzhia, the Russians need to strengthen their grouping by several 100,000 personnel. Accordingly, based on this understanding that they do not have such resources at least now, we cannot talk about serious offensives in Zaporizhzhia, and even more so, to talk about a threat to Zaporizhzhia, and even more so to tie it to the statements of the lying dog of the Russian Federation, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov. So, let's move on and talk about what is happening here. There are threats in the Vuhledarsko-Vremivsky direction, so to speak. There is the village of Velika Novosilka and the entire Vremivsk section of the front line, which was recaptured by Ukrainian troops in a major counteroffensive in 2023. Now, unfortunately, the Russians are showing a tendency to do what I mentioned earlier. From Zolota Niva and Prychishivka, they can threaten the flanks and rear of Velika Novosilka. In fact, this success, which was demonstrated in the form of captured territory in the area of Zolota Niva on the deep state map yesterday, is a manifestation of the fact that the Russians will undoubtedly try to advance further here and create threats to Velika Novosilka. Unfortunately, this is true. Unfortunately, this is the reality. After Vuhledar, the Ukrainians may have some certain problems, which I also mentioned, that the Russians will try to push the Ukrainian defense to the Velika Novosilka-Kurakov line. That's why the most fierce fighting is now taking place along this line, both in relation to Kurakov and Velika Novosilka. The most important thing to talk about is the threats that are now emerging for Hirnik, because the Russians are trying to advance to Novoselidivka to the east of Hirnik. Novoselidivka, Izmailivka, cutting through this settlement, which is an important stronghold in the area, from the west. Izmailivka, Hirnik, Kurakivka, Zorina is one agglomeration. Here, the Russians decided to advance to Novoselidivka from the flank in order to continue their movement and cut the Ukrainian defenders along the road that goes further south to Kurakova. Of course, cutting this road will have a negative impact not only on the supply of this area, which is marked with a blue square, but also on the encirclement of the entire region. So far, this encirclement is not even close to being a possibility, but the trend is what it is. The Russians, realizing the complexity of the fact that they have stopped attacking literally the fortified areas that the Ukrainians have, are trying to flank them. This is the scenario they are trying to implement in Kurakivka and Hirnik. Hirnik, which, let me remind you, is the dominant height in the area, because at a distance of just a few kilometers from Hirnik, the entire Ukrainian grouping south of this line opens up. Thank you, friends. That's all for today. Subscribe to the channel to keep up with the latest developments. This video was prepared by Hustler. See you soon.